Okay, well, first of all, let me thank Sabah and all the wonderful student organizers of this conference, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I'm particularly pleased that I'm going to speak first, and then I can stop worrying about my speech and pay attention to everybody else. I'm very happy also to hear what Sabah had to say because I think that you will find that at least there are some themes in what he had to say, particularly about struggles and how struggles are central to the making of history, which hopefully you will find also resonate with what I have to say. The title of my talk is The Geopolitical Economy of the Arab Revolutions. And I will, without further prefatory remarks, just jump right into it. The Arab revolutions that opened the second decade of the 21st century are pregnant with more possibilities for progressive, anti-imperialist, democratic, and egalitarian historical change in the region than any event for many decades. However, the work of history is not the blind work of impersonal forces, but of conscious women and men armed with a reasonably accurate understanding of the historical moment. However, such consciousness is today not exactly in plentiful supply in a region which has suffered uncountable setbacks on practically every front in recent decades. Ejaz Ahmed, who we are so sad to hear couldn't come due to ill health, but in his various writings on these events, at one point, he identified a very important problem, I think very accurately, and here I'm quoting him. The dilemma of the middle-class youth who have risen so heroically against these servant dictators, he's referring to people like Mubarak, is that they are themselves products of American liberalism. The rhetoric of democratic reform that periodically emanates from the high and mighty in Washington inspires them, as does Barack Obama's slogan of change, contentless, but delivered with great rhetorical aplomb. They look at the US as a harbinger of democracy and hope that if they make enough noise and trouble in the streets and if they can demonstrate the magnitude of protesting numbers, Obama will somehow dismiss the likes of Mubarak from imperial service. Obviously, this is a slightly dated quote, but I think it does identify an important issue we must deal with. If the values of freedom and democracy are to be rescued from their thraldom in US discourse, we need an understanding of the history of the region and of its place in the world order, which exposes the conceits and hypocrisies of US and Western discourses. While I cannot claim to be any sort of expert on the national histories of this region, in this talk I attempt at providing what I call a geopolitical economy of the Arab revolutions. In doing so, I wish to convey two key messages. First, the progressive potential of the Arab revolutions will only be fulfilled if the task of rebuilding the economies and societies on a more productive and egalitarian basis is taken up. This task requires a mature commitment to political organization and economic planning, a requirement that often runs athwart the current vogue for networked and decentralized forms of power and Proudhonist forms of economics. It requires a critical appropriation of the legacy of an earlier age of Arab nationalism. Secondly, the strength of imperialist forces, which will undoubtedly oppose such a rebuilding, while not inconsiderable, is far less formidable than recently dominant discourses would have us believe. The 21st century opened with a quantum leap in the scale and intensity of US imperial interventions in the Middle East and North Africa region. The Bush administration went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the Second Intifada inaugurated a new phase of heavily lopsided US intervention in Palestine. However, a few short years later, this new imperialism was bogged down in the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, and by 2008, in an as yet unresolved financial and economic crisis. It was in this context that the series of Arab revolutions began, bringing down hated dictators supported by the US and threatening the imperial order in the region. However, no order dies a willing death. And in the 2 years since these revolutions began, the US has supported a war in Libya and is now supporting proxy wars in Syria and Mali. not to mention undertaking uncounted and uncountable covert operations across the region. These interventions use the metaphor of an Arab Spring to advance imperial goals behind the Arab revolutions. How effective have they been? It is safe to say that the neoconservative claim that the Arab Spring is simply following the example of the democracy that the Bush administration installed in Iraq is ludicrous. However, the claims of the so-called Obamians, as one writer calls them, it's a bit of a tongue twister actually, but anyway, the small network of close aides who provide a window into Obama's ideas and reasoning, which is the dominant influence on the Obama administration's foreign policy. These are quotes from James Mann's book of that title. Their claims that the revolutionary events represent the fulfillment of the new president's Cairo speech are widely credited, if often cynically. Most left-wing and critical writing either evades the question of change in the degree of imperial control or assumes that there has been none. Indeed, some, like the vast swathes of the left that supported the US-led intervention in Kosovo, not only assume that the US government remains largely in control of events in the Middle East, but also appear to believe that it should. And if some see US influence slipping, they attribute it to the imperial overstretch under the Bush Jr. administration, something that can and likely will be rectified by a more cautious and calculating Obama administration. The argument I want to make today takes a radically different perspective. It's based on my recently published Geopolitical Economy, After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, in which I question prevailing wisdom about the nature of the capitalist world order in a way that makes the contemporary emergence of multipolarity comprehensible. In this perspective, the Arab revolutions appear not as a singular set of events, but only the latest installment in a long history of anti-imperialism in the region, whose earlier chapters include the conflict over Suez and the nationalization of oil industries, just to take two examples. Geopolitical economy argues inter alia that contrary to the cosmopolitan one-world discourses, and here I include in this category free trade, hegemony, stability theory, both in its mainstream and world systems versions, as well as globalization and empire. Contrary to these discourses, geopolitical economy argues that states, as nationally organized blocks of capital, have played central roles in shaping the capitalist world order. And this, the capitalist world order that is, I conceive, along with Marx, as what he called, quote, the relations of producing nations, unquote. Which is why one of the reasons why I use the expression geopolitical economy, because these relations are at once economic and political, and we have a long-standing tendency to analyze these two things quite separately. These cosmopolitan discourses have served less to comprehend the world order than to articulate and justify actual or attempted domination over it by a single power. That is why in them, either no state matters, as in free trade or globalization, or only one state does, as in hegemony, stability theory, and its most recent epigony, empire. My critique builds on dissenting intellectual traditions, among whom I include Marx. One of the points that I make, which may perhaps surprise some, but perhaps not someone like Kevin Anderson, who is yet to get here, is that you find, if you read Marx properly, Marx points out that under capitalism, it is not just classes that oppress other classes, but also nations that oppress other nations. So anyway, among these dissenting intellectual traditions, I include Marx, the classical theorists of imperialism, the Bolshevik account of uneven and combined development, critics of neoclassical economics such as Keynes and Polanyi, the sprawling recent literature on the developmental states, and the economic history of Robert Brenner, to name just a few. The alternative account of the capitalist world order I build with these resources understands the evolution of that order as a dialectic of uneven and combined development, in which combined development, including combined capitalist development, as well as transitions of backward countries to socialism, plays a critical role. And it's worth emphasizing that either in the mainstream literature, which talks about uneven and combined development, either combined development is entirely forgotten, or its meaning is restricted to understanding the transition of backward countries to socialism. So that the entire issue of what you get when you get capitalist combined development is completely evaded. So combined development ensured that while British dominance in the early decades following the Industrial Revolution was inevitable, after all, England industrialized in a world which was still largely pre-industrial. That was a no-brainer. Of course, it had a productive dominance. So while this was in the early decades, such productive dominance by the UK was inevitable, the combined development of contender powers, the US, Germany, and Japan preeminently, would also make it unrepeatable. For that combined development already made the world multipolar. This is what the most penetrating writing of the time, ranging from that of the social reformer John Hobson to Marxists such as Lenin, Hilferding, Bukharin, and Luxemburg, which constituted the first theories of international relations on the new competitive imperialism, was all about. At a time when territories with weak or no states remained available for colonization, industrial competition between a plurality of major capitalist powers was bound to issue into imperial competition. However, in the course of what Arno Meyer called the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, he's referring to the period from 1914 to 1945, this multipolarity appeared to mutate into what has since been termed US hegemony. Charles Beard and William Appleman Williams, in very different periods and in different modes, had long argued that the US had always conceived of itself as an expanding empire. And by the early 20th century, it had reformulated its expansionary aims into a desire to emulate 19th century British dominance for the 20th century, at a time when British dominance was already widely recognized to be waning. Since for this latecomer on the new imperialism scene, formal colonization was more or less out of the question, this mimesis had to take a light form. And the US settled for trying to replace sterling with the dollar as the world's currency, and London with New York as its financial center. The underlying idea was that doing business anywhere in the world would be for US corporations, as it had been for UK companies, more or less like doing business at home. And it would be facilitated by the worldwide reach that New York's financial institutions would acquire. However, even this reduced ambition could not be attempted until the two world wars had increased US relative power by raining destruction on other capitalist powers and boosting US productive capacity. Geopolitical economy's final argument is that the story of post-war world capitalism makes most sense when told as a series of failed attempts by the US to establish and maintain the dollar as the world's money. Even the alleged peak of US power in the 1950s and 60s, the dollar's career as the world's money, was deeply troubled. A dollar shortage was followed by a glut of unwanted dollars and led eventually to the closing of the gold window. The reason was quite simply that the US was a national, not an imperial economy. That is to say, the only reason Britain could furnish the world with liquidity in the form of sterling was because it was able to export colonial surpluses as capital. The US had no such opportunities. The reason, therefore, quite simply was that the US was a national, not an imperial economy, and the world, too, was no longer imperial, but one in which combined development was a reality, not least because of the existence of the USSR, the strongest form of combined development to date. That is why the most prescient analysts, to name a few, Chomsky, Kees van der Pijl, Fred Bloch, insist that post-war policy was aimed not just at communism, but also at national capitalisms. However, until the most recent financial and economic crisis, the US remained powerful enough to attempt to sustain the dollar's world role through a series of short-lived stratagems. The last two were globalization under the Clinton administration and empire under the George W. Bush administration. For post-war US dominance was undermined by combined development among its Cold War allies, but also in the developing world. That sort of combined development peaked in the caesura of the 1970s, with the fracturing of the world economy into national capitalisms and, of course, socialisms, all straining at the US leash. While it was also through the launching of the, whether it was through the launching of the European snake, currency coordination, or the developing world's call for a new international economic order. The apparent restoration of the neoliberal decades that followed rested on a series of unstable financializations, please note the plural, which culminated in the current crisis. And while they imposed severe deflation on most of the world, those developing countries that were able to resist them continued their combined development, leading by the turn of the century to the rise of the BRICS and other emerging economies. The recent Great Recession and financial crisis accelerated it further and forced the recognition of the world's multipolarity. Today, arrangements for displacing the dollar in international payments are being made are being proposed and even made, from an expanded role for special drawing rights through barter and swap arrangements for trade financing to regional institutions for reserve pooling. While it is still difficult to tell exactly how long the dollar's already diminished role will linger, and it has certainly been prolonged by the crisis in the Eurozone, its fate is now governed by forces its makers cannot control. I wonder if I can just show you a couple of pictures just to make my point. How do I get it to? There it is. This chart just shows you the share of global foreign exchange transactions involving the dollar from roughly 90% in 2001 down to 62% in 2010. This is currency's share of global foreign exchange transactions. Again, this 84%, by the way, in 2010, it's not actually 84%, but it's 84 per 200. That is, so that in fact it's more like 42%. And here, just as an interesting picture here, this is the trade-weighted dollar index from 1970, which is right there, to 2012 or so, roughly the present point. I've just downloaded this graph from a Federal Reserve website. This is the peak of it at the point when the Plaza Accord was made, but this peak, of course, is based on Volcker shock interest rates. And since then, as you can see, the trajectory has been down. There is another peak here, and that is the globalization peak or the stock market bubble peak. And since then, you can see in the 2000s, the trajectory of the dollar has been downward all the time. So this turning point does not signal the end of imperialism, but certainly marks the end of a long era in the history of capitalist imperialism in which single powers could dominate or attempt to do so. Geopolitical economy's account of capitalist imperialism has implications for how we conceive 21st century imperialism. The materiality of nations argument, as I call the first argument, focuses on the challenges to imperial power, including unspectacular and subsequently reversed ones, and on their lasting gains, however meager they may be. The inevitability, unrepeatability argument should break our habit of assuming that one hegemony will naturally be replaced by another one. And the failed attempts argument should help us appreciate the debility of the US economy and state and the limits of its imperial reach, its still gargantuan capacity to rain destruction around the world notwithstanding. Now we are ready to elaborate on the geopolitical economy of the Arab revolutions. We begin with the important fact that the MENA region was the last major region of the world to be absorbed into the system of capitalist imperialism because, and here I'm quoting Rashid Khalidi, alone among the major regions of the world, it bordered directly on Europe and was thus an object of the dueling and contradictory ambitions not only of the two greatest global empires of the age, Britain and France, but also of the neighboring Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, as well as of nearby Italy and fellow imperialist latecomer Germany after their respective unifications in 1870. Of the two chief drivers of US policy in the region, oil and Israel, oil and more generally other economic opportunities for imperialist capital come first. Arguably, they also enjoy primacy. The great powers were only beginning to partition the region in the early 20th century, with Egypt falling into, with Egypt and Iran falling into the British sphere, Morocco into the French, and Central Asia into the Russian, when oil acquired its modern importance. This was when the Royal Navy made a strategic decision to shift to oil-fired battleships. In the First World War, it was widely understood control over oil made the difference between victory and defeat, and that realization reshaped the region. Several things may be noted. Despite the West's newfound eagerness for oil, the dialectic of uneven and combined development had reached a point where imperial arrangements had to leave the Turkish Republic, the new Turkish Republic, and Iran as independent states. Secondly, the mandates system represented a wider international conjuncture in the unfolding dialectic of uneven and combined development, which had made colonialism deeply illegitimate. And finally, and by the way, and in this process, the Bolshevik Revolution had a very, very critical role to play. And the peace decrees and their insistence on their anti-imperialist position generally. Finally, though imperial conquest over the rest of the region prevailed, the British decision to jettison direct colonial rule in favor of establishing a native kingdom in Iraq showed, as it was just an example, but this sort of example showed that popular resistance to imperialism was, from the start, a major factor in the situation. Contrary to the hegemony stability story, while the US undoubtedly sought to inherit the British imperial mantle, and by all accounts, the British on the whole sought to facilitate the project, this is the real content of what we today call the special relationship, the post-war US role was far from hegemonic. The limits in the Middle East were manifest in the establishment of radical nationalist regimes in the region, the Suez Crisis of 1956, the nationalization of oil industries beginning in Iran in 1951, Iraq in 1961, and Egypt in 1962, and beginning in 1967, the sponsorship of the Palestinian cause by the radical regimes of the region. While these forces of combined development of communism and nationalism, with these forces of combined development of communism and nationalism raged against it, only US control over the swing producer, Saudi Arabia, kept oil prices at the low levels that were so important to the golden age of capitalist growth. And the US approach to the question of Israel and Palestine remained even-handed, that of an honest broker. The lineaments of the contemporary lineup of forces in the region emerged only after the Six-Day War, and even more after the Yom Kippur War. So Israel became central to US policy in the region just when declinism became the dominant assessment of the US world role. The US had closed the gold window after fighting a losing battle to maintain the dollar's gold backing. The era of stagflation, which turned out to be the onset of what Robert Brenner calls the Long Downturn, had begun. Oil prices were quadrupled amid rising tensions between the US and its Arab as well as European allies. And the US lost a major war to a nation of what were essentially peasants. Things seemed only to get worse over the decade. The loss of unilateral economic policy prerogatives could be seen in the beginning of the contentious G7 meetings, the Iran hostage crisis, the nose-diving dollar, and the Volcker shock, which was necessary to rectify it. And the 1980s, for all the hype about Reagan's restoration, replaced the none too spectacular US industrial and export performance of the golden age with outright deindustrialization, as Japan bought access to US markets in return for being the US's greatest creditor, while the financialized pattern of US growth that now began culminated in the 1987 stock market crash. By 1991, the economy of the alleged victor of the Cold War had entered the doldrums, such that George Bush Sr., the incumbent president who had won the Cold War, lost an "it's the economy, stupid" election to his Democratic challenger. And this, as I detail in my book, was followed by two further phases of bubble-driven growth, which have today landed the US in the economic mess it finds itself in. The development which would lead US military hubris to eventually take leave of economic realities, this development is basically the migration of the US military hawks, known today as neoconservatives, from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, is contemporaneous with these developments. They also became closely allied to what Mearsheimer and Walt called the Israel lobby. Essentially, since the mid-1970s, while US foreign economic policy would henceforth be focused on contriving one stratagem after another to keep the dollar status as the world's currency, its military policy would increasingly be driven by a cabal that had avowedly, that is to say by their own account, taken leave of the reality-based community. If US policy in the Middle East is driven by oil and Israel, the transmissions are of qualitatively different sorts. While one can detect some modicum of rationality in the case of oil, such rationality is much less apparent in the second case. Indeed, it is the absurdity of the US policy on Israel that led Mearsheimer and Walt to propose the existence of this Israel lobby. To be sure, it had a certain rationality to begin with. When the war in Vietnam was going badly, a potent Israel that had routed the Arabs in 1967 came to be attractive to the United States as a proxy stick with which to beat Soviet proxies in the Middle East. And early on, US policy in the region even produced victories for the US. The quadrupling of oil prices, for example, was matched by an agreement between the US and the major OPEC countries that they would deposit their oil surpluses in Western banks, thus backstopping the downward sliding dollar. And the most important of these regimes, the Egyptian, was won over to the US side and signed a separate peace with Israel in the 1979 Camp David Accords. However, the positive effect of the agreement on recycling petrodollars had worn off by the end of the decade, necessitating the recession-inducing Volcker shock. While winning Egypt over only set the US on a path which inflamed Arab and Islamic opinion and jeopardized not only US security, but that of much of the rest of the world. And this was a quote from Mearsheimer and Waltz. The 1980s coincidence of right-wing governments in both Washington and Tel Aviv meant that Israel now pursued an aggressive settlement policy, invaded Lebanon to root out PLO bases there, and attempted to set up a client government, all with US connivance. The intolerable burdens this put on the Palestinians resulted in the First Intifada, and eventually the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, under which final status issues such as sovereignty and statehood and Jerusalem were deferred in return for what was called self-government over dozens of scraps of territory, divided by Israeli checkpoints that would become increasingly heavily militarized. From here on, even a change in government in Washington would make no difference. Though the Republicans had lost the 1992 elections, the neoconservatives left behind an important legacy, the 1992 defense policy guidance. Just when US economic weakness and its newfound dispensability after the end of the Cold War were forcing the US to fight the Gulf War against Iraq with Saudi financing and a ragtag coalition of the willing, the 1992 defense policy guidance aimed to keep the US, quote, the predominant outside power in the Middle East, unquote, so as to preserve, quote, Western and US access to the region's oil, unquote. Theirs would be done even under a Clinton administration, for it represented a Democratic Party which had accepted the policy and electoral terms of the Reagan Revolution, and thus a new cross-party consensus on most aspects of policy, above all economic and military policy. Though many have noted that the new imperialism of the Bush administration well predated 9/11 in the project of the new American century and so on, fewer have noticed the deeper continuities between the Clinton and Bush administrations, which were evinced by the US's unilateralism over Kosovo, its initiation of the bombing campaign in Iraq, and the passage of the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998, which committed the US to regime change in that country. Our whistle-stop tour of US imperialism in the Middle East has finally brought us to the more familiar terrain of the 2000s and Bush's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and two things are important here. As is now being increasingly widely recognized, although it's not completely accepted, for all its awesome and destructive power, the empire project, like the globalization project before it, as I show in Geopolitical Economy, has been a failure of which the Arab revolutions are a major symptom. And secondly, the Obama administration's foreign policy is no different from that of the Bush administration in terms of its motives. The real difference lies in ever-narrowing resources and options for pursuing it. To make the first point, I need do little than recall the late Giovanni Arrighi's verdict on Bush Jr.'s empire. Although the initial shock and awe campaign appeared to succeed, by June 2003, and I'm quoting large bits of Arrighi here, US casualties began to increase, slowly but relentlessly. Worse still, political and economic returns per casualty declined precipitously as US plans to remake Iraq to suit American interests clashed with the realities on the ground and had to be revised, downsized, or abandoned. The Iraq War had been an attempt to restore US military credibility after the defeat in Vietnam, and this failure, and it's interesting, isn't it, how even its critics shy away from calling it a defeat. This failure is, quote, far greater and less remediable than that in Vietnam. For Iraq is not Vietnam, and 2003 is not 1968. And again quoting Arrighi, in purely military terms, the Iraqi insurgents, unlike the Vietnamese, do not field heavy armored vehicles, nor do they have long experience of guerrilla warfare in a favorable natural environment, or enjoy the support of a superpower like the USSR. Moreover, since Vietnam, the US military was professionalized and became far more technologically advanced. This was the army that was failing in Iraq. The reasons for this are twofold. On the US side, the increasing reliance on what I call capital-intensive warfare is itself a result of the inability of the US state to motivate enough of its citizens to serve the imperial cause, has been, as interestingly conservatives like Andrew Bakovich have so eloquently detailed, doomed to fail. On the Iraqi side, contrary to innumerable attempts, scholarly and journalistic, to cast doubt on the nationhood of countries of the Middle East and of the Third World in general, it's quite interesting when coming from India, when I first encountered this tendency, and it's always puzzled me. I think I'm now getting to understand where it comes from, but this tendency to say, oh, the countries of the Third World are not really countries, usually by pointing to the artificial nature of their, and imperial nature of their boundaries. Contrary to this tendency, and here I'm quoting Rashid Khalidi, over several generations, states that often unsuccessfully battle foreign control and occupation, states that were also weak and ruled over diverse and divided populations, were nevertheless able to employ the powerful tools of a national education system and all the other means available to a modern state for shaping opinion for national purposes. This helped create loyalty to entities that have now a remarkable solidity, although none of them existed as independent sovereign units 100 years ago. And to this, I would merely add that I think that if you look at it from the perspective of uneven and combined development, the fact that a modern nation, whatever it is, however incongruous it may be internally and so on, it's also a community of the economic destiny. And in that sense, I mean, today, if you read writings on inequality, your national belonging is a far greater determinant of your level of material, your material well-being than is your class belonging. Anyway, to go further, Khalidi singles out two countries as exemplars of this development: Lebanon, which had weathered extraordinary internal and external stresses, and Iraq, which in spite of three wrenching and painful wars in just over 20 years and powerful challenges to its internal cohesion, seems to have developed a strong sense of national identity. That's why, as Noam Chomsky put it in a recent interview, the United States was seriously defeated in Iraq by Iraqi nationalism. Mostly by nonviolent resistance, step by step, Iraq was able to dismantle the controls put in place by the occupying forces. In November 2007, the Bush II administration came out with an official declaration about what any future arrangement in Iraq would have to be. It had two major requirements. One, that the United States must be free to carry out combat operations from its military bases, which it would retain. And two, encouraging the flow of foreign investments into Iraq, especially American investments. A couple of months later, in the face of Iraqi resistance, the United States had to give that up. Iraq was an attempt to reinstitute by force something like the old system of control, but it was beaten back. In general, I think, US policies remain constant going back to the Second World War, but the capacity to implement them is failing. That's the end of the Chomsky quote. The changes we are witnessing in US policy is not contra James Mann and his conception of a new, more cautious Obama US foreign policy. Rather, as Andrew Bakevich has argued, four real developments are forcing change on a Washington which remains as yet not quite capable of recognizing them. First, as Bakevich has argued, the freedom agenda, which sought to reshape the Middle East to complement US economic and geostrategic needs, has collapsed. The US can only claim victory by surreptitiously lowering the requirements of victory. And one may add the people of Tunisia and Egypt underlined an important truth, that democracy is the work of the masses, not of would-be imperial powers. Second, the Great Recession, unlike other periodic downturns in US history, appears intractable. And this has implications for the ability of the US to sustain its gargantuan military budget, not least because of the prolonged recession, which has begun to, not least because the prolonged recession has begun to hurt middle as well as working classes, and is making questions about who has paid the costs and who has enjoyed the benefits of the past decades of widening economic disparities and bubble-driven growth at home and militarism and war abroad. These questions can only be postponed for so long. The limited liability patriotism, this is a wonderful label of Andrew Bakevich's, under which most citizens of a nation at war enjoyed credit-fueled consumption while sticking, I support the soldiers in Iraq stickers on their fancy new cars, while a small minority served repeated tours of duty can no longer be postponed. Sorry, can no longer be repeated. That this sort of experience cannot be repeated. As this conference opens, the axe of sequestration is already falling on at least some parts of the military budget. Third, the lid taken off by the Arab revolutions cannot be put back on again, not militarily and not through deceptions and ruses. And finally, other powers, such as China, preeminently, but also Russia, now stand in the way of the achievement of US objectives in the Middle East as elsewhere, as the instance of Syria most preeminently shows. There is also the potential for disagreements among the so-called triad between Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. None of this is to say that US and Western powers, and even newly emerging powers, will not continue to attempt to impose their will. That is indeed what imperialism is. It is, however, to say that for those who oppose them, the twin luxuries of complacent and convenient cynicism, the assumption that Western imperialism has it all wrapped up anyway, if that's what we believe, why are we even here? Why are we trying to, resist anything? And so that's one luxury. And the second luxury of informal network political activity have just become unaffordable to those who wish to take up the opportunities this newest and most hopeful historical turn of events affords. Thank you.